done with this ladder?
Yeah, he's done with everything. We got the Wi-Fi set
Shrink
up.
on?
Huh?
Shrink on?
It's on.
I mean the video.
I got it working, but it's not showing the countdown though.
I mean, like video. You live?
Yes.
Video?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I'll wait until after. Let me go grab my... Go ahead and get started. Even if I'm only talking to two people. So far, I think two more will be coming in. Okay. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. And so we are now on the next lesson, which is on the topic of immanent moralism. And immanent moralism, well, I'll define it in a minute, but let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll just jump into this. The sooner we get into it, the sooner we'll be done. Lord God, we just thank you so much that we're able to, gather together and continue the study of apologetics, where we learn how to defend the faith against those who question the hope that we have. We're in the point, Lord, where we are refuting competing religious claims, and I pray, Lord, just that in everything, the words I speak are true, and that those who listen to this will be equipped and ready to respond to anything that comes from the unbelievers, Lord. So be with us as we go over immanent moralism, religions of immanent moralism, and how to refute them. And we just pray all this to you, God, and in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we are continuing with our critique of opposing religious views. We've already dealt with secularism, like atheism, evolution, the problem of evil, secular dualism. So now we started talking about competing religious claims. And last time we started with Hinduism, which I said is a form, it's transcendent mysticism. It's a religion where you assume everything's spiritual, this world's an illusion, you don't really exist, and your goal is to be dissolved into the great it, that exists, right? So we refuted that soundly last time. And so the second category of religious belief is called immanent moralism. And immanent moralism, this is the idea, I'll explain this again in a minute, but anyhow, As presuppositionalists, I just want to remind us that we don't seek to defend a God, but a very specific concept of God. So it's not like we're happy when people hold to other religions. It's like, no, they hold to a false version of God. Only the biblical God, or the God of the Bible, provides the worldview that offers the preconditions of intelligibility, and only the biblical God is free from arbitrariness and inconsistency. And so, as I mentioned last time, Greg Bahnsen categorizes all religions into three groups: transcendent mysticism, which was Hinduism, we talked about that last time; immanent moralism, which we're going to talk about today; and then the third and final type will be biblical counterfeits, which we'll start that next time. And so again, this lesson, we're going to focus on immanent moralism. And so what is this? I mean, it sounds kind of complicated. So what immanent moralism is it's pretty much where it's a type of religion where you focus on the here and now. Okay, you're focusing on this world rather than emphasizing what's to come in another world, right? They don't even think or care about what's beyond the physical world. They don't concern themselves with life after death or the nature of God. In fact, two of the most prominent examples are Confucianism and Buddhism. So these are Far Eastern religions, right? And so both Confucianism and Buddhism view reality as being something that's not beyond our experience, but instead they say it's nearby. Right? So they reject transcendent mysticism. They reject that mystical living, like, meditating and doing this and that to become one with the universe. No, they're not for that. Instead, what they want to figure out is, how do you live the best way you can in this world? And as a result, they're going to follow a moral code. That's why we call it immanent moralism. Immanent is in the here and now, and then moralism, it's the moral code that they're following. Now, it doesn't mean these religions are atheist, because they're focusing on the here and now. Although Buddhism originally was atheistic, but most Buddhists today believe in some sort of God. But the point is, as I'm trying to say, it's not that these views are atheistic. Instead, spiritual matters to them don't exist outside of human experience in this world right now. They're not looking for some illusion world. They're not looking for some afterlife. They're just focusing on here and now. So if there is a God or a bunch of gods or spiritual forces that exist, they say, well, those have to exist within this world, right? Otherwise, they're irrelevant to us. In fact, they'll say gods or deities matter very little to these religions, because the ultimate goal of immanent moralistic religions is to just give you a moral code that you can live by. Now, we're going to demonstrate the futility of this type of religious worldview by discussing two of the largest and most historically significant versions of it, Confucianism and Buddhism. So I'll start with Confucianism. So Confucianism was founded by the Chinese philosopher Kung Fu Tzu. That's how you say his name in Chinese. But in the West, we always call him Confucius, which really is a bad translation of how to say his name. But hey, it stuck. So Confucius, his life dates are 551 to 479 BC. He was born into the nobility, meaning he was upper class in China. And despite that, though, he entered the civil service at age 15. Various financial hardships befell his family, so he had to go get a real job within the government, and he rose through the ranks. He ascended to the position of the Minister of Justice at age 50. Now, that's a pretty high position in China at that time, in charge of justice for the whole nation. And during that time where he's working for the government, he expended a lot of effort studying ancient history and ancient philosophy. That way he could be as knowledgeable as possible. But after 7 years at the height of his career, he was ousted. Court politics ended up knocking him out. In other words, there were other people that wanted his job. And they did little tricks and convinced the ruler that Confucius is no good. So he ended up losing his job, and he was exiled from his home province. That'd be like if you were born and raised in California and then you get kicked out and you can never come back. That's what happened to him after just being in his position for 7 years. So when you're a loser politician, which Confucius was, really, and you lose your political career, what else can you do? You can become a teacher. That's what he does. He becomes a teacher, a philosopher, and really as a teacher, he's a lot more successful. He gets thousands of disciples by the time of his death. Now, one thing worth saying is Confucius did not invent any new religious doctrine. Instead, he believed all the traditional Chinese stuff, like there's this abstract idea that heaven rules earth. They call heaven Tian. And Tian, which is impersonal to them, rules earth. And Tian somehow destined Confucius to learn these truths about the world and to teach them to others. And so if you were actually to read Confucian works and study Confucianism closely, it seems more like a socio-political ideology than a religion. It really sounds like a social code more than, hey, this is a religion. But for some reason, historians still classify it as a religion because it demands that you live a certain way. It demands that you live a certain way. And so what he did is he combined the concepts of ren in Chinese. Ren means to seek the welfare of others. So you have the obligation to seek the welfare of other people. He combined that concept of ren with another concept called li. Li means doing the right thing at the right time. So consider other people, consider the welfare of others, and always seek to do the right thing at the right time. Ren and Li. And through that, he created this moral code that he thought would fix the political, social, and moral chaos of China. And just to let you know, if most people in America don't know anything about Chinese history, their extent of it is they watched Mulan, which is not a very accurate movie historically. But during this time, China was in the Warring States period. And so you had various kingdoms in China all competing with each other for power. So there was a lot of chaos. And he's thinking, this system I'm creating will unify the whole Chinese people and create a world of order and harmony and all that kind of stuff. It'll get rid of the chaos. He argued that all human interaction really comes down to 5 basic relationships, okay? And how you live in these 5 basic relationships. And if everybody gets these 5 relationships and they get it right, then society will be fixed. And so these 5 relationships, I'm going to give them to you in the order of importance. So the first one is father and son. That's the most important relationship in Confucianism, is father and son. The father has the job of showing kindness, and the son has the obligation to show obedience, right? So father and son, father's rule is kindness, the son's job is obedience. Technical name for this is filial piety. Okay, piety to your father, right? So father and son is the first big relationship in Confucianism. The second one is elder brother and younger brother. I'm assuming today they would say also elder sister, younger sister. But women, you just didn't count back then, so, especially in China. So what can you say? But the idea between elder brother and younger brother is the older brother shows gentility and the younger brother shows humility, right? So depending on which one you are, you have different obligations. The third relationship is husband and wife. Isn't that something? That's what we elevate at the top as Christians. I mean, obviously our main relationship is between us and God, but among humans, husband and wife is at the top. Confucians put it as number 3. Okay, father and son is the most important relationship. Older brother and younger brother is the second most, and then husband and wife. I find that kind of weird, right? But husband and wife, where the husband is supposed to show righteous behavior and the wife is supposed to respond with obedience. The fourth relationship is elder and junior, just in society, right? Those who are older and those who are younger. The elders are supposed to display humane consideration, and the juniors are supposed to show deference. Deference means you defer to what the older people want. So in this culture, Confucian cultures, there's a lot of respect to those who are older. And then the fifth relationship is ruler and subject. Okay, the ruler is supposed to lead with benevolence, and the subject is supposed to show loyalty to the ruler. Now, those 5 relationships and what you're supposed to do depending on where you fit in each of those relationships, that is what's supposed to fix society. That's what's supposed to fix the world. The sacred text of Confucianism is something that Confucius wrote called the Analects. Okay, the Analects, that's that's their main, I guess you could say, religious body of teachings that come from Confucius. Now, observers note that in Confucianism, there's very little emphasis on ritual or meditation or enlightenment. Think about Hinduism that I was talking about. It was all about these rituals and these mantras and trying to be enlightened. Confucians didn't care about being enlightened. They're like, what good's that going to do? You're off sitting in a lotus position, meditating on what you think the oneness of reality is. You're no good to anybody. The Confucian focuses on living in this world and being successful in this world, according to those teachings that I just mentioned. The Analects describe how the noble person is supposed to live. For example, the noble man should be educated, cultured, and courteous. If that's how you are, educated, cultured, and courteous, then you're a very successful person and you're going to do well in life. And what if everybody is educated, cultured, and courteous? Then the whole society will be great. So if all people try to live, if they strive to live by this moral code, he's saying you will gain mastery over the real world. So let's pretend a Christian goes over to China, runs into a Confucian, and you try to preach the gospel to a Confucian. That Confucian is going to be trained to dismiss your claims, because you're bringing to them a transcendent message. You're talking about this God who lives outside this universe, who's bigger than the universe, and ultimately is preparing us for an age that doesn't exist yet, the perfect age to come. The Confucian's going to be like, that's irrelevant, because I live in this world right here. And anything that's going to have meaning for me has to be right here. And so God transcendent from this has no meaning to me. You could take your Christianity back to the West or wherever. We don't need it here. All I need as a Confucian is my code to get by in this world. Okay, so that's what you're going to run into if you run into Confucian. So, with all that said, how does one refute Confucianism? Well, of course, we're going to use the PIA. That's what we've been using the whole time in this course. We're going to check for the preconditions of intelligibility. We're going to check for inconsistency and arbitrariness. And then at the end, we'll also look at the consequences that these religions have had on the world. Now, Greg Bahnsen suggests that the most devastating refutation of any religion of immanent moralism is that there's so many of them, right? There's a whole bunch of them. And now at first glance, you might say, well, that's not a refutation. Just saying, hey, there's a whole, you guys are a dime a dozen. There's a whole bunch of immanent moralistic religions. How is that a refutation? Just pointing that out. Well, when you think about it and you contemplate the implications, it really does savage any religion of immanent moralism. In other words, you ask this question: who is to say that Confucius is right? Why listen to him? How do we know Confucius was right and Buddha was wrong? How do we know Confucius was right and Lao Tzu was wrong? You know, there's a million of these on the market, right? How do we know his system is better than others? Maybe the Roman Stoics were the ones with the right code. They had a code too. Why is Confucius's code better than theirs? How could anyone know what code is true? Why care that Confucius says that the noble man keeps these 5 relationships? And my point is, it all goes back down to authority. What authority does Confucius have? He's only a person like you and me. No better than us. He's a finite human being with a 3-pound brain. He lived in a pre-scientific era. In fact, he lived in a China that didn't just think the earth was the center of the universe. They actually thought China was the center of the universe, right? So, I mean, you're dealing with people who didn't know that much about a lot of things. What authority does he have? Right? He possessed a non-exhaustive knowledge like everyone else, and he was a sinner like everyone else. So whenever somebody appeals to a regular man as an authority, we are reduced to relativism. We really are. Because, to throw this big word out there again, epistemological authority cannot be justified based on our finitude. What I mean is, if you're going to say the authority comes back to a human, a regular human, no human other than Jesus, because he's God as well, no human knows everything. We're finite. We're limited in what we can know. So I might be a little smarter than some people, but some people might be a little smarter than me, but none of us knows everything. None of us even is close knowing everything, and none of us on our own can authoritatively say this is the right code. Because you could disagree and say, hey, I came up with a better one. I could say, no, you didn't. Yes, I did. Oh, yeah, let's settle this with an arm wrestling match. That doesn't prove anything, right? And then 10 other guys say, well, I got my own code, right? And so again, why should I pay attention to Confucius? That's what the Christian should ask. When the Confucian tries to reject your gospel, you should just be blunt and say, why should I care what Confucius said? In fact, I would be straight to the point. I would be blunt. I'd be like, he's a man that held a job for 7 years, got fired, and then became a teacher. Why would I dedicate my whole life to a guy who could only hold a job 7 years before he got fired? I mean, what the heck does he know about successfully navigating society when he got fired after 7 years, right? Why am I going to listen to him? So the point is, Confucianism suffers from arbitrariness, or the A in the PIA. Now, of course, the Confucian might try to respond and reverse the question. He'll say, okay, well, who is Jesus that I should listen to him? So if I say, who's Confucius, and they say, who's Jesus, are we at an impasse? No, not at all. Because the Christian's answer is that Jesus isn't just a man. He's the Son of the living God. He's going to judge the whole world. As a result, he not only is infinite and possesses exhaustive knowledge, he does, right? He's not only that, but he also is the one who created the moral standard. Jesus is the one who created the law, the Torah, and he created it stems or flows out from his own nature. Therefore, Jesus, as the God-man, is the only one with the authority to hold us all accountable to that standard, right? So here's the thing. The Confucian might not accept this truth. They might say, well, we don't believe he's the Son of God. But that doesn't matter, because we could still say this. We could say, yes, but in the Christian explanation of things, it makes sense for us to say Jesus is the authority. We are consistent. Our story hangs together. But you, the Confucian, you are not in this position. Because in your worldview, you say the world is controlled by impersonal heaven, Tien as you call it. It's not a personal God. And so in a world where the ultimate reality is impersonal heaven, what is so special about a mere man like Confucius? He's no different than all the rest of us. Now, if the Confucian says, well, it's Confucius, it's his wisdom that makes him special, I could say, says who? You? Other Confucians? You guys say he's wise? Lao Tzu would have disagreed. That's why he came up with Taoism. So who's to say that he's wise? Who was the person who held a contest where he said, may all the wise people come before my contest and put forward their wisdom so I could judge on my own authority which one wins? Who's the wisest, right? No such contest ever occurred. And even if it did, how could the person who's the judge of the wise people know authoritatively who the wisest was? Unless there was already an objective standard of truth and morals that transcended humanity. And that's the point. The only way a moral code could be true is if you have objective morality. But objective morality transcends human experience. It's above and beyond us. This type of religion rejects transcendence. It's trying to give you a code, but it's trying to give you a code without transcendence. But a code depends on transcendence. Otherwise, it's subjective. It's like every other code out there. One is not better than the other. If one is true, that means there's objective reality. And if there is objective reality, then there has to be a transcendent ground for it. That's my point. Immanent moralism fails. These type of religions have no transcendent authority to which they can appeal, so they cannot justify their positions. Confucius can never explain how the impersonal Tien put the right views in his mind. Instead, he arbitrarily asserted that he knew what was right, and when questioned as to how he knew this, his response was, it's his destiny. It was my destiny to know this and teach this code. Well, his code is nothing more than his opinion. Why should I listen to it? I don't need his opinion. I'll listen to somebody else who didn't get fired after 7 years, right? He received no special revelation from God. He didn't receive special revelation from his impersonal heaven. He had no divine words that were explaining the true wisdom that was given to him. As a result, Confucianism is incapable of proving itself superior to its competitors. How can it? It can't. It has no ability to do that. We, Christians, on the other hand, We have a personal transcendent authority that has given us special revelation, the Bible, right? And that special revelation commands us to listen to Jesus. This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. We're commanded that by God, right? So it makes sense in the Christian story that Jesus is the only way to the Father and that every knee should bow to him. Now, the Confucius might reject this and face the eternal consequences of that, but what he's left with in the meantime is just an arbitrary worldview that philosophically cannot be justified. Now, in addition to arbitrariness, there's also inconsistency within the Confucian worldview. That's another great weakness in any form of immanent moralism, is going to be inconsistency. All forms of it, including Confucianism, tell you that the problem, our problem, is that we don't live according to the right code. Your problem as an individual is you fail to live according to the code. Our society's problem is we fail to live according to the right code. And these people will admit that all humans have failed to live according to the code. Well, if all people have failed to live according to the code, then clearly something's wrong with all people. And that's not what they're addressing. To them, it all comes back to the code. But listen, if something is wrong with all people, then it doesn't matter if you give us the code. The problem's with us. We're going to fail to keep the code every time. So it must be true then that we need outside help, okay, from outside this world. If all of us are incapable of keeping the code, if all of us have broke it, we need outside help, transcendent help, that can help us and change us so we can live by the code. In other words, if humanity is guilty of not following the right code, then before any code could do you any good, there has to be a solution that changes man so that man could follow the code and stop failing. Religions of immanent moralism never offer that. They just say, keep trying to do the code. Try harder. Doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. So this proves then that the Christian concept of redemption and deliverance is necessary. But none of these moralistic religions have the concept of redemption. Again, you try to preach redemption to them, it makes no sense to them. They've never thought in these terms. And you have to explain to them, how's your code going to help if everybody fails it, including you, right? There's something more that we need. We need redemption, okay? These immanent moralists are just going to say, no, just try harder to follow the code. Well, let's say you become a Confucian tomorrow. It doesn't change the fact that for your whole life up to that point, you've spent your entire life breaking the code. You haven't followed the rules of Confucius. So what can you do about this? Confucianism's only answer is, well, start living by the rules. But that was the problem to begin with. You weren't able to live by the rules. What's going to make you able to start following the rules? Even worse, let's say if by some miracle, okay, a miracle happens and you can now live according to the code starting today, the guilt that has been incurred from all your past failures to live by the code still would not be dealt with, right? Think about it. In society, if a murderer, let's say a guy who just murders a bunch of people, serial killer, if a murderer stopped murdering today and got this new ability to live peacefully for the next 10 years, okay, but then he gets arrested 10 years from now for all those murders, he still has to serve the prison sentence of the past guilt, right? When that jury judges him, they're not going to say, well, we know you killed 20 people, but man, the last 10 years you haven't killed anybody, so you don't have to pay for those 20 people you killed. No society would do that. The person would still be found guilty, go to prison, and pay the sentence. That's how the real world works. So it doesn't matter if you adopt the code today and follow it perfectly for the rest of your life. What are you going to do about all the failures? You're still guilty for all the failures. So my point in saying this is these moralistic faiths, they not only can't deal with the problem of man's law-breaking nature, okay, they have no solution to fix our law-breaking nature, but they also can't deal with your guilt of past law-breaking. See, this is a great internal inconsistency that exists in all forms of immanent moralism. It makes these religions useless. Only Christianity offers a moral code, the Torah, that is not arbitrary because it comes from God's nature And at the same time, Christianity deals with man's nature, our sin nature, with regeneration. We're born again. We're given a new heart, which changes us to be able to follow God's moral code. But that wouldn't be enough, right? If God merely changed us and regenerated us to where we can now follow the code, we're still guilty of all of our sins. So you also need a second thing, justification. You need something that deals with our past guilt and any future guilt. And only Christianity gives you justification, where your sins are completely forgiven because Jesus died in your place, and you get his righteousness credited to your account. So that takes care of your past law breaking, right? Forgives you, covers you for the future, and then at the same time, God gives you that new nature so you can start keeping his code now. My point with all this is it's not wrong that there's a code. I mean, you have to have the right code. But what the Bible shows us is even with the right code, just read the book of Romans, the law is good, but sin in us takes that law and uses it for evil. Like Paul says, once I read the commandment, do not covet, then I started coveting everything. It was sin within me, right? The problem is with us. So even if you, like Confucius and Buddha, they have law codes that they made up. But even if you have a law code that God gave us, which we have, without regeneration and without justification, you got nothing. Only Christianity provides a coherent worldview where we've got the right law code, we got the right moral code, but we also get the new nature and we get the past guilt taken care of. Islam doesn't have that. Buddhism doesn't have it. Nothing has that. So again, if we're looking at the inconsistency of the PIA, man-made moralistic codes, they're bankrupt. Now, sometimes people ask about Judaism, because obviously Christianity is built off of Judaism, right? The Old Testament's 2/3 of our Bible. That's where we get the Torah. So some people wonder, like, okay, if we're dealing with Judaism, does it have the same problem as Confucianism? Yeah, today it does. It does. So, like, the difference is Judaism has the right law code, okay? It has a non-arbitrary law code because the law comes from God. But modern Judaism has nothing that changes our nature. They don't have a concept of regeneration, which would enable us to follow the law. So they too are going to tell you, just try harder. And that doesn't work, right? And they have no means to provide for justification because there's no animal sacrifice system. So again, yes, the Old Testament, it teaches about God's circumcising the heart. That's regeneration. That's in the Old Testament, right? And the Old Testament talks about justification through substitutionary atonement. But these fundamental Old Testament truths are ignored in most expressions of modern Judaism. And so Christianity, though, does hold to these. We've got atonement through the sacrifice of Christ. We've got regeneration through the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And we have the all scripture that has been breathed out by God, that's given to us, that is useful for teaching and rebuking and correcting and training us in righteousness. So, again, our system works, is my point. This was all fulfilled perfectly in the person of Jesus Christ. The law, everything. So, anyhow, Confucianism, getting back to that, cannot meet the preconditions of intelligibility. So it fails under arbitrariness, because who's Confucius, right? It fails under inconsistency. There's no way that your nature will be changed or you could deal with past guilt. But it also fails to meet the preconditions of intelligibility. Okay? Now, Confucius, he wasn't even thinking about preconditions of intelligibility. But it doesn't matter. All worldviews have to account for it. If a worldview is going to be true, it has to account for the uniformity of nature, the laws of logic, moral absolutes, all that kind of stuff. Confucianism can't. The existence of a moral code, for example, requires an objective, unchanging standard that is immaterial. Okay? Also, any ability to live according to the code requires a uniformity of nature. If nature just keeps arbitrarily changing every day, how are you going to live according to a code? So for you to live according to the code, the world has to be regular. It has to be maintained under God's design. Confucianism doesn't account for that. It doesn't even try. Like atheism, it just takes it for granted. Well, we live in a world that works. Okay, but what is the precondition of that? Uniformity of nature. What's the precondition of the uniformity of nature? The transcendent absolute God. that the Bible presents. You can't have that apart from God. So Confucius, what he did is he reasoned his way to his conclusions without ever asking the question like, well, what's the precondition of reasoning? Oh, logic. But logic is immaterial laws that are outside of this world. Yet I'm using them to say that all that matters is what's in this world, right? It's contradictory. And how can we account for the laws of logic? Again, there has to be an infinite mind in which we are analogically pulling from the laws of thought that exist in God's own mind. That's what logic is, right? So he's not even thinking of that. He's not even trying to account for it. His worldview could not account for logic, can't account for uniformity of nature. Confucianism provides none of the necessary preconditions of intelligibility, not one. So when these factors are taken into consideration, Christians have nothing to fear from any system of immanent moralism. They're arbitrary because of the problem of authority. They're inconsistent because they prescribe a solution they prescribe as a solution the very problem itself. The problem is we can't follow the moral code, and so they say the solution is to follow the moral code. Doesn't work, right? Doesn't work, okay? And then lastly, they fail to meet the preconditions of intelligibility. So that covers Buddhism, right? That covers Confucianism. Pretty easy, right? So we get 2 for 1 tonight. That's a special, only for today, right? And so we just dealt with Confucianism. Now we're going to deal with Buddhism. And really, even though they're quite different from each other, they're still both religions of immanent moralism. And so they'll end up following the same, but we need to understand what Buddhism teaches. So that is what we will do now. So Buddhism is a religion that emerged from Hinduism. Now, Hinduism is what I talked about last time. Buddhism came out of it and really rejected Hinduism. It rejected transcendent mysticism as the means to enlightenment. Buddhism still wants to figure out how to be enlightened, but they don't think you're going to get there through Hinduism's transcendent mysticism. And so this religion was founded by a man named Siddhartha Gautama, who, as far as we could tell, if he did exist, he lived from 563 to 483 BC. And he founded Buddhism as an alternative to the Hindu background that he grew up in, right? So he rejected the religion of his upbringing and invented a brand new one. Now, what we know about him is he was born to royalty. So he was the son of a ruler. And at some point in his life, he renounced the luxury of his life. And he came to reject the world itself. And what caused this is he says he got a vision of what he calls 4 passing sights. He says, I saw the vision of 4 passing sights, and it made me leave my life of royalty to seek the true meaning to life. Now, the 4 passing sights were as follows. The first thing he saw, he said, was an old man nearing death. So you have an old guy about to kick the bucket. And then second, he saw a disfigured and diseased man. So an old guy getting close to death, and then a guy even closer to death because he's diseased and disfigured. And then the third thing he saw was a dead man's funeral procession. So somebody died, and he sees the funeral procession. And then the fourth thing he sees is a shaven monk, meaning a Hindu monk completely shaved. His ribs are all popping out because these Hindu monks think the way to get to enlightenment is by starving themselves. And so he takes all 4 of these sights, and he comes to one conclusion. And let me just ask, what do all 4 of these have in common? Like, were any of these good sights? Were any of these happy, like a birthday party of a bunch of well-fed people? It's all suffering. Yeah, so this vision, because he's living this life of royalty, but then he has these 4 passing sights of extreme suffering. And he became convinced from this that all life is suffering. Even his life as a rich prince, well, one day he'll become old and near death. He'll become diseased and disfigured. And even if he becomes a monk, or one day he'll die and there'll be a funeral procession. And if before then he shaves his body and becomes a monk that starves himself, it's not going to delay the inevitable. Still, eventually, suffering's going to come. So he came to the conclusion all life is suffering. And therefore, he needs to find a solution. So he joined at first the ascetic Hindus, the Hindu monks, where he nearly abused himself to death. He almost starved himself to death with them, and he realized that, this doesn't work. Renouncing the world and trying to live as a monk did not make him enlightened. It didn't solve the problem of suffering. It just made it worse. And so what he decided to do was set out and study suffering. He'll become an expert on suffering so he could learn its meaning and figure out how to avoid it. And so according to the Buddhist story, he was meditating under a tree, and Mara, which is like the devil in Hinduism, Mara tempts him for 49 days until he emerged victorious from the temptation. And at this point, he gained what is called enlightenment and became a Buddha, right? Or the Buddha. So his name wasn't Buddha. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. The word Buddha just means enlightened one. So after defeating the temptations of the evil one, he became the enlightened one, the one who now knew the truth, the only person in the world who cracked the code and figured out how to overcome suffering. And so hence he was called the Buddha. Now, in his thing, anybody who becomes enlightened, you could call a Buddha. And there have been many Buddhas in Buddhism, they would say, but he's the one that you would give the definite article to. He's the Buddha, because he's the first one that supposedly figured this out. So now that he's enlightened, what he says is he proposes that you should follow the middle way. And the middle way was this way between luxurious pleasure and suffering. So it was kind of moderation. And once he was enlightened, the interesting thing is he claimed there were no gods. He's like, well, now that I've been enlightened and I know all the truths of the universe, I now know there's no God. Now, I want you to think about that. Okay, that's very strange because he came to his enlightenment after being tempted by a god for 49 days. That's how he becomes a Buddha. I was tempted by a god, a bad god, but a god. And now that I become enlightened, what I realize is there's no gods. Well, then what the heck was he tempted by? I mean, so as Westerners, we would say that makes no sense. That's a contradiction. But then what they'll do is they'll give you a really dumb example that convinces them, but doesn't convince us. They'll say, well, it's like using a boat to sail across the river. When you're on the water, you need the boat. But once you're on the land, you get rid of the boat. And henceforth, there is no boat. When I'm 100 miles inland, there is no boat. And so pretty much, when I wasn't enlightened, there was this God tempting me. But now that I'm enlightened, it's like I don't need the boat anymore. There's no gods. Okay, but a logical person's going to still say, but you say there are no gods. But you were tempted by one to get to the point where you say there's no gods. Look, you could use your boat analogy all you want. When I'm 100 miles inland, I'm not going to say there's no boat. I'll say there's no boat with me now. But there was a boat then, right? It's just logic. That's common sense. But no, they'll say that and sound all wise in their mind. And a bunch of hippie Westerners will be like, oh, there is no boat. And it's just like, ugh. The point is it's silly. A foolish thing is still a foolish thing. Now, what he asserted is he asserted that his enlightening experience showed him that there's something wrong with humanity, suffering, right? That's what's wrong with humanity. So Siddhartha, or the Buddha, he didn't ask people to believe what he said because he said it. In that sense, he's different than Confucius. He's not appealing to himself as an authority. Instead, he says, believe what I say because you experience it. Everybody suffers. So when I tell you that all life is suffering, and I figured this out, don't take my word for it. Look at your own life. Have you suffered? Well, yeah. Well, see, I'm right. You've experienced it. So that's what he's appealing to. He says the ultimate authority is actually your experience because you know that life is suffering through experience. You didn't learn it from the gods. And he says, and there aren't any gods, so don't worry about it. But even if there were, you didn't learn suffering from them. You didn't learn suffering from authoritative teachers like our Hindu Brahmins. You didn't learn it from them. Instead, you learned it just because you're alive. And because you're alive, you suffer. And so he said, so don't quote me as being authoritative. I have no authority. Just look to experience and it'll confirm what I'm telling you. Acquiring truth through experience makes truth immanent rather than transcendent, right? If we're going to go to a Buddhist that thinks like him, and we start talking about the truth that God has said, they're going to be like, hold on. No, truth is from experience. What your God is saying is not something I experience. It's something coming outside of me. No, the authority is me and what I experience. That's how I learn truth, right? So it's a very different way of thinking. That's how they see the world. So Buddhism, you could really say it's a learn-as-you-go type of religion. That's why a bunch of Hollywood actors like it. You know, it's what you want it to be at a particular time in your life. Well, I'm just learning as I'm going, man. My experience is my teacher. You know, and so right now my experience tells me that I don't have to listen to you because I haven't experienced what you're saying. You know, it's like, and we could come back to them and say, well, we've experienced regeneration. We've experienced the new heart. We feel this new life. And so, trust me because I experienced it, right? But they'll say, but I haven't experienced it. So again, you end up just going in circles with them. Now, since Siddhartha favored a kind of atheism because he said there were no gods, he denied the supernatural altogether, and he focused only on life in this world. That's why it's a religion of immanent moralism. Also, he argued that the chief end of man, right? So what do we say the chief end of man is? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. Siddhartha said the chief end of man was to eliminate suffering by having the right experiences. See, very different, because God tells us that suffering that exists in this world right now, he's actually working for our good, and we will inherit a world where there will be no suffering later. He'll take care of the suffering. But the suffering that happens right now, it's a teacher, right? He's using it to teach us, to grow us, to mature us. Well, Buddha's like, no. The chief end is that we eliminate suffering, and the way we eliminate suffering is with the right experiences, right? The right experiences. So he articulates this in the Four Noble Truths. Okay, according to him, these Four Noble Truths explain everything. The first truth is that all life is suffering. Okay, or you could say it this way, suffering is universal. But he'd say the first noble truth, all life is suffering. The second truth then comes from this. The second truth says suffering then, if all life is suffering, suffering comes from human desire. Okay, it's our desire that makes us suffer. Or, some translations would say craving. Human craving is what makes us suffer, right? And then the third truth flows from this. If you could get rid of your desire or your craving, then you get rid of suffering. Okay? So all life is suffering. Suffering's caused by desire. Third, if you could get rid of the desires, you could get rid of the suffering. And then fourth, right? How do you do this? Well, through the eightfold path, right? By following the eightfold path, I'll explain it in a second, but this eightfold path will then help you get rid of desire, which gets rid of the suffering, which then will make you enlightened. Now, ultimately it comes down to detachment. The only way you will not have desire is if you could be detached from this world, to where you don't care what happens. So I think one of the best examples of this is, think of the Jedi and the Jedi Code. George Lucas was pulling from a lot of this. The Jedi, why aren't they supposed to fall in love? Why aren't they supposed to get married? Because attachment leads to, attachment leads to like whatever, which leads to whatever, and anger. And then like Yoda tells Anakin that when he's got the issue, like he's troubled over visions he's having about someone that he might lose, and Yoda tells him, well, the best way is to detach yourself and pretty much like detach yourself to such a point where you now have nothing left that you fear losing. That's Buddhism in a nutshell. And you watch one of my favorite Chinese-made movies is Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. I could watch that over and over again. And the whole point of the main character is he's through meditation trying to become so detached. He then becomes the perfect monk and perfect warrior and can fight because he doesn't care if he dies. Doesn't care if those around him get killed because he's detached. He's the enlightened one. So the whole point of this religion is the only way that you achieve this status is if you become so detached from the world, You desire nothing. And so even if you are suffering, you're not really suffering because you're not craving anything. You get what I'm saying? Again, it doesn't make a lot of sense in the real world. They could tell themselves they're not suffering, but they're really suffering. They could tell themselves they have no desire, but they're desiring that they have no desire, which is a desire. You can't escape this. But anyway, how you detach yourself is through this eightfold path. The eightfold path, it's where you're supposed to be devoted to 8 right or complete principles. So the first one is right understanding. You have to have right understanding of what? Everything, right? And then you have to have the right resolve, and the right speech, and the right action, and the right livelihood, and the right effort, and the right mindfulness, and the right concentration. If you have the right of all those things, then supposedly you would be able to reach the state of detachment. Now, it's precisely this part of Buddhism that makes it moralistic. You have these 8 things that you have to do right? So by adding moralism to the immanent nature of our experience, Buddhism possesses an immanent moralistic religious foundation. The Four Noble Truths provide correct belief, according to them, and the Eightfold Path provides correct actions. And when a person has the right belief and the right actions, they could then eliminate desire by detachment, and then they eliminate suffering. And when you reach that perfect state of detachment, you become a Buddha yourself or an enlightened one. Now, they will say that in addition to these 8 paths and all that, or eightfold path, proper meditation, they would say even certain yogas and certain mantras can help in your quest. And again, they reject the body itself. It's a body-rejecting religion. Our body has these desires. But if you could become detached, even from your body, mentally, then you're detached from hunger. You're detached. Like, these things don't bother you. You don't care anymore. And so then you're not really suffering. That's the idea behind Buddhism. Now, of course, Buddhism did not remain as this simple, pessimistic, self-centered attempt at self-extinction. Because that's the goal of Buddhism, is self-extinction. Once you become enlightened, the goal of Siddhartha, he said, once you become enlightened, you don't exist anymore. Once you die, you don't get reincarnated again. You're done. And just like Hinduism, the goal is to not exist. Because life is suffering. Why would you want to be here where it suffers? So it's a self-centered attempt at self-extinction. Now, by the time you get to the time of Christ, a lot of Buddhists revolted against the traditional beliefs that were set forth by the original founder, Siddhartha Gautama. And what you had was a new type of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism. As Buddhism spread out of as it spread out of India, it went to Thailand, then it went to China, and started working its way up Asia. As it got outside of Thailand, what happened is, like, Chinese people and Japanese people and so forth, what they did is they blended Buddhism with their folk religions. And so this idea of no God didn't cut it for them. They're like, well, no, there's got to be some gods, right? We'll make Buddha a god. And then a lot of people who become enlightened after him, we'll make them gods. And some of our folk gods were just Buddhas and stuff like that. And you know what? Extinction, okay, maybe for some, but for others, maybe we become enlightened, and then we become bodhisattvas. A bodhisattva is somebody who becomes enlightened, and you become kind of like a demigod. And you don't cease to exist. You are almost like an angel at that point, and you keep coming back to help people over and over again. So you become like a smaller type of god. So again, as it mixed with these polytheistic cultures in China and Japan, Buddhism then turned into a typical polytheistic religion. So if you were to talk to a Buddhist from China or Japan, they're going to have multiple gods. If you talk to a Buddhist from Thailand, they still hold to the original one, which is called Theravada Buddhism, and they'll be atheists. But here's the thing, they're not very serious about it. And here's what I mean. About maybe 8 or 9 years ago, maybe more than that, as a chaplain, I had to supervise a bunch of other chaplains, and I had a Buddhist chaplain candidate. And he was a Theravada Buddhist, one from Thailand, where he didn't believe in any god, right? And he had to be celibate and all that kind of stuff. And then, like, I noticed a year later, he got married and had a kid. And I'm like, well, what happened? He's like, well, I converted to Mahayana Buddhism. I'm like, because you saw a girl you liked, right? So now all of a sudden he moves from this Buddhism to that Buddhism, but they don't care. The ones in Thailand are like, yeah, he could do that, right? He could still get enlightened. And then it's just weird. It's like, so hold on, you're saying this is the right way, but then it's okay to hold this contradictory version of it, but they're all fine with that. And then I had another Buddhist monk that was under me. He belonged to a form of Buddhism called Pure Land Buddhism out of Japan, and that one's different than all the other ones. So I'm like, my goodness, you guys just can't keep this together. But anyhow, whether you're dealing with Mahayana Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism, they still are going to fall under the same arguments because they still have the same immanent moralistic principles that were founded by the original Buddha, and they're going to suffer the same weaknesses. So let's get to that. What should be the Christian's response to the Buddhist? Well, just like with every other worldview, we're going to use the PIA technique. We're going to pinpoint the arbitrariness and the inconsistency by reminding the Buddhists of some of Siddhartha's teachings. For example, if a Zen Buddhist out of Japan or a Chan Buddhist out of China, that's just the Chinese version of the Zen Buddhist, if they come up to you and they claim that you need to meditate on the sound of one hand clapping, right? Because there is, I know in The Simpsons, Bart's like, Lisa, listen, but really, by definition, to clap, it takes two hands, right? So if they tell you, hey, you just meditate on this non-existent idea of the sound of one hand clapping, and it'll help you break free from attachment, you should ask them, who says so? How do you know? If he responds, well, the Buddha said this, then you as the Christian could respond with, but Buddha said not to believe something because he said it. He said he has no authority, right? So if Buddha tells me to do something, I have no reason to do it because he himself said, don't do it because I tell you, do it because you experience it. I can't experience the sound of one hand clapping, so why should I listen, right? And so again, by your own standard, you haven't given me a valid reason to believe in this. Now, the Buddhist might then appeal to the Zen authorities. Well, okay, there have been many authorities after the original Buddha. But again, Siddhartha, the first one, said there are no authorities other than experience. So why should I listen to any of your Zen authorities? Now, if the Buddhist concedes and then argues, well, listen, it should be believed by experiencing it. Experience it, and then you'll know it. As the Christian, I could say, but I've never experienced it, and therefore I have no reason to believe it. You're telling me to believe it because you've experienced it, but I haven't experienced it, so why would I believe it? And then at that point, the Buddhist might tell the Christian, well, you ought to, or you should. But then I could reject this and say, well, it might be a waste of time. I could read a magazine instead. I could go to the movies. I could take advantage of my daughter's discount on snacks at the movies, whatever. That could bring me enjoyment. Natalie knows exactly what I'm talking about back there because she gets that discount too, And so my point with all this is the Buddhist can't justify what he's asking people to do. He can't justify, he can't arrive there at Buddhist conclusions. You just can't. Their presuppositions inherently contradict each other. Buddhism asks people to shut off the mind, shut off the brain, and have an experience. They often recommend Eastern meditation as a tool because they say if you empty your mind, that could create detachment. That's why they say meditation is one of the big ways that you could become detached. Well, suicide would be a lot less work to achieve their goal, right? It's like, hold on. Suffering can end if life ends. In fact, no life, no desire, no suffering. So maybe the way to get rid of suffering is just to annihilate humanity. Maybe we all just launch off the nukes. Boom. That's a simpler solution than all this meditation and starving myself and stuff like that. And my point with bringing up those absurd examples is there are other ways to end suffering. So why do I need Buddha's version? Why do I need his eightfold path? There's other ways to end suffering. Now, the Buddhists will say, yes, but only life-affirming activities to achieve the end of suffering are good. Only the ones that affirm life. But you could say, well, on what authority? On what authority can you say that? There has to be an objective standard for you to say life-affirming activities are greater than suicide, right? Do you, who rejects God and rejects the transcendent ground, do you have an objective standard? Yes, I agree that life-affirming activities are what we're supposed to go for, not suicide, right? But I could say that because the God who made everything tells us that, okay? But on Siddhartha's authority, we got no reason to say that. He claimed to have no authority. He claimed there's no God. He claimed there's, all life is suffering. Okay, end it. End it by a much simpler means. And listen, my point here is not to be callous or encourage suicide. Definitely not. Instead, I say it this way to reveal the inconsistent and contradictory nature of Buddhism. Right? If what they believe was really true, there's a much easier way to end the suffering, is my point. They don't have to worry about hell or anything like that. So if what they believed was really true in their mind, why not do a simpler solution like this? And my point is, it's arbitrary because people are told to believe something and act on it because Buddha did so and said so, yet he also said he had no authority. And so it's contradictory. It's inconsistent. Being tempted by a God to conclude there are no gods and being told to listen to Buddha when he said don't listen to him are pretty big inconsistencies. But their religion, it's filled with these. It really is. Now, some of the same problems of Confucianism exist in Buddhism as well. Like a Confucian is going to reject Buddhism because he's arbitrarily accepting Confucius's teaching. The Taoist is then going to reject both because its founder Lao Tzu also said, well, you need to follow the way or the Tao. You don't need to follow Confucius. You don't need to follow Buddha or the Eightfold Path. Follow the Tao. And then comes in the Shinto believer from Japan. Says, no, you need to follow the kami, the gods of Japan. And they got this moral code for us. Listen, following any of these options is going to make you guilty of arbitrariness because none of these people have any real authority. Instead, you have the arbitrary opinion of Siddhartha in disagreement with the arbitrary opinion of Confucius and Lao Tzu and a Shinto priest, right? And that's true of any other and all other forms of immanent moralism. It just doesn't work. Now, in terms of inconsistency, Siddhartha claimed that man does not have a soul. In fact, he called it an Atman, which means non-soul, non-spirit. So he says you don't have a soul. But then he says, but be careful that you don't build up bad karma. And so right away you should be thinking, well, hold on. Karma comes out of Hinduism. He came out of Hinduism. Obviously, he still believes in karma, but karma is a transcendent property of souls in reincarnation. If you remember back to Hinduism, you have a dharma, a duty, and if you don't do that duty right, you get bad karma attached to your soul. And then when you die, you stand before whatever this impersonal system of judgment is, and if you have more bad karma than good, you get reincarnated as something less than you were in this life. If you have more good karma, then you get reincarnated to the next level up. This guy says there's no soul, but then he says, but make sure you don't build up bad karma. I mean, that's an inconsistency. How could you have karma if you don't have a soul, right? So he knew this idea made no sense. He knew it was nonsensical. So then he came up with a metaphor to try to get around it. He said, our existence is like a flickering candle that passes on a flame to another candle. So imagine you have a candle and it starts to flicker a little bit, and right when it goes out, that flame ignites the next candle. In fact, for those of you who like the cartoon Avatar, which I love the cartoon, but the worldview behind it is, it's all this. And so there's this episode where the last avatar dies, and then it shows a candle flicker, and the new one light up, and you have baby Aang being born. They took that straight out of Buddhism. That's where that's coming from. So his idea is you don't have a soul, but your life it flickers, and then right when life dies from this body, that same life flickered into this next baby that was born. And so it just keeps happening that way. But once you become enlightened, it stops flickering. So that's how he would say you got to worry about bad karma. But really, it still doesn't make sense. But before I explain how it doesn't make sense, just understand that when he was dealt with this unanswerable weakness of his philosophy, he resorted to a metaphor, just like Plato did. That seems the best that these guys could do. His metaphor does not explain how life flickers from one body to a new one if there's no soul. if it's just your life that flickered, right, then how does that work if there's no soul? He just asserted that it does. He just said this is how it works. So his answer to his own inconsistency was to be more arbitrary than he already was. And if he's correct that there is no soul and somehow our lives flicker into new babies, yet our memories die with the old baby, then why care about bad karma, right? It's not you. That's a completely different baby. Yeah, your life flickered into it, but that's not you anymore. And if you're not going to remember what you did in this life, and if you're not going to come back as a cow or a frog, then why worry? Eat, drink, and live a hedonistic life because your bad karma is just going to hit that next baby, right? It's not going to hit you, right? And so it doesn't make any sense. And remember, the ultimate goal in Buddhism is nirvana. Now, nirvana is not just a pop band or a grunge band from the 90s, okay? And nirvana is not the Asian version of heaven. Sometimes people in the West are like, yeah, man, I'm going to go to nirvana you don't go to nirvana, okay? Nirvana means extinction. It means the flame has gone out. It's been snuffed out. So in Buddhism, the goal is to no longer exist. Because when you no longer exist, then there's no suffering. And so you reach that perfect detachment, the flickering stops, you become extinct, and you no longer suffer. But here's the thing. If there is no soul, then death would lead to your extinction anyway. You might be like, well, no, because I flickered into the next baby. But that baby you flicker onto is not you. The you that's trying to escape suffering is gone. No more memories. So you've already achieved it without achieving it. The point is, the more you think about it, this religion makes no sense. You're at the end of your one life, you're going to be extinct. Just because some form of your life flickers onto a different child, it's not you. You've obtained your goal. You're not caring about this next person. Okay, so my point is Buddhism is so sought with contradictions, or so wrought with contradictions, that it's powerless in accomplishing its stated goals. Now, both Buddhism and Confucianism, they demonstrate that religions of immanent moralism have a big problem with both arbitrariness and inconsistency. Again, there's no authority in these religions to justify their moral code, and the inconsistencies are insurmountable. And even the consequences, because remember, we always look at the consequences of these worldviews. So even the consequences have proven more negative than positive. For example, Confucianism. What did that lead to in history? Well, it created a caste system, a very oppressive caste system in China that then got exported over to Japan. And so if you know anything about the shogunate, the period of Japanese history where the shoguns were in control, they had a caste system based on Confucianism that was just really oppressive. And there was no chance of vertical social mobility. Their system was so oppressive that if you weren't a samurai, you're just a merchant or a peasant, if a samurai wanted to chop your head off for no reason, they could. You weren't allowed to fight back. You just had to take it. And so, it was bad. That's the type of thing Confucianism led to when you have these 5 relationships where there's always one person on top and the other person on the bottom, right? It allows for a real oppressor and oppression type of matrix, unlike the critical theory version today. But there was a real one in the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. Also, let's talk about Buddhists, right? They're not known for their scientific discoveries or advancements. Science depends on an attachment to this world. Science depends on a thirst for discovery. But if all life is suffering and your goal is to get out of this world, then you're not going to try to discover anything. That's why you don't have all these famous Buddhists that have invented cures for diseases and created schools that led to literacy for the masses. They didn't care about all that. Right? When the goal of your religion is detachment, science is not going to happen. Helping people like Christianity has isn't going to happen. The 19th century sociologist Max Weber made strong arguments that the religious worldviews of the Far East, meaning Hinduism and all these immanent moralistic options, he said they created societies that were incapable of groundbreaking scientific advancement. They were incapable of having industrial revolutions. He said it happened in Europe because the Protestant societies of Europe and their Christian worldview understood the world in such a way that all these advancements came from it. Again, it's because our worldview is true, and it works best in this world because it's true. Now, I do want to say this. I'm not arguing for the cultural superiority of the West in and of itself. Now, I do believe the West is culturally superior because we do have just better results and all that. But it's not inherent to the West, meaning it's not a white people achievement. I want you to understand what I mean by that. God did not birth Christianity in the West. He birthed it in the ancient Near East. It came out of Judea, came out of Israel, which is in the Middle East, not the West. But Christianity, the West was pagan. It was Greco-Roman pagan and Celtic pagan and Viking or Norse pagan, right? Those aren't the things that have given the world all these blessings. Christianity did. Why we say the West is because Christianity was adopted by the West. It transformed the West. It displaced the paganism and created this, or it spread this worldview that comes from the Bible throughout Western civilization. And when you have a civilization that holds to these principles for 1,000 years, you're going to get these benefits that come from it. So it's not that it's the Western people are superior to Eastern or Southern people. It's not that. It's that the West specifically had Christianity for a long time. It's Christianity that makes Western civilization superior. But as Western civilization's rejecting Christianity and clinging back to paganism, the West is a mess right now, right? People don't know what a boy is and what a girl is and all that kind of stuff. We're in a mess now because people are re-embracing the paganism that Christianity displaced. But anyhow, so my point with that statement is that worldviews have consequences, and the fruit of possessing the only true worldview is scientific, industrial, and technological advances. They came out of Europe for a reason, because Europe was Christian. Now, finally, what I'll say about consequences, or just all of this, right, is Buddhism cannot account for the preconditions of intelligibility, right? Think about it. Remember, uniformity of nature, laws of logic, moral absolutes. It provides no authoritative explanation for the uniformity of nature, logic, or moral absolutes. It doesn't provide any rationale for the reliability of the mind. In fact, Siddhartha argued that reality itself is an endless and circular chain of cause and effect. He says there was no first cause. There's no first cause. He says it's just an endless chain of cause and effect. And so he says nothing is or can be permanent. It's just a no beginning, no end, cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect. Okay, so nothing can be permanent. That was his way to remove an absolute being, because no being could be permanent in an endless chain of cause and effect. But don't you notice that the endless chain of cause and effect is permanent? He says nothing can be permanent except the system of cause and effect. That's somehow permanent. Right? If that could be permanent, why not an absolute God be permanent, right? And so again, his system makes no sense. Besides the fact that observable and scientific evidence, like the law of entropy, demonstrates that the universe is not endless, it's not eternal, it did have a beginning. Every scientist agrees on that, okay? That's been proven. Yet Siddhartha's position is there was no beginning, so he's already wrong, okay? But not only is his view just absurd on those grounds, but he hasn't proven anything. He hasn't provided any preconditions of intelligibility. He simply asserted that things flow in this never-ending sequence, which assumes a uniformity of nature without accounting for it. How can it flow in cause and effect and work as a law if there's no uniformity of nature? And how could an unplanned system by itself have that? It can't. You run into the same problem that atheists run into. The only way we could account for a uniform nature in a predictable world is with an absolute sovereign being, God, who sustains it. But the Buddha developed his very idea of the endless uniform chain in an attempt to deny the existence of the God that's necessary to maintain it. So this is the worst kind of contradiction. If it's true, it's false. It's the worst kind of contradiction imaginable. So truly, a Christian apologist can easily confound the Buddhist without much difficulty. The argument from folly shows that Buddhism is devastated by all parts of the PIA technique. The argument from truth always demonstrates that Christianity alone is the necessary precondition of intelligibility, and it's free from arbitrariness and inconsistency. So, with all that said, let me conclude. Christians are not stuck in a Mexican standoff when faced with other religions. And if you don't know what a Mexican standoff is, it's the famous cowboy movies where you have three people with guns, right? So I'm pointing at this guy, that guy's pointing at both of us, and it's like, all right, who's going to fire first? And then it usually ends where they're like, and they all start firing, and then all of them die. So what atheists try to say is that when you compare world religions, it's like a Mexican standoff. Everybody's pointing the gun at each other, but nobody's really going to win. That's not true. What presuppositionalism shows you is that, no, those other religions are wrong. Only Christianity is true. The same way we're able to overcome secularism with presuppositional apologetics, we could do that to competing religious claims. And so tonight we did that with religions of immanent moralism. They failed to meet the preconditions of intelligibility, just like atheism and secular dualism and religions of transcendent mysticism. So referring back to the martial arts analogy that I tend to begin lessons with, the two religions we covered today, they're kind of like weak fighters. If we go back to the Hinduism, right, transcendent mysticism is like the Chinese kung fu master that believes he has telekinesis, and you'll just see him thinking, and then his students fall down at the end of the room, but then a real fighter goes up and punches him in the face and it's over, right? That's like Hinduism. And then the religions of immanent moralism, they're like the guys who only know two punches. They might be good at their two punches, but as soon as you have somebody who could kick and knows a lot more than two punches and can grapple, I'm sorry, this guy's not going to last. And so my point is, these Eastern religions are very easy to defeat with the presuppositional argumentation. So these two categories of religion are fundamentally flawed, and that's why it was possible to evaluate them each, Hinduism and now immanent moralism, each in a single lesson and refute them. I think a much more formidable problem is posed by the third category of religious belief, and that's the biblical counterfeits. The reason why they're harder is because they take the Bible and they use it. So now they have certain parts of our worldview, and because of that, they could account for certain parts, certain preconditions of intelligibility. It gets harder. See, like when we're dealing with people who are detached from the Bible, they're so easy. But when we're dealing with people who try to use the Bible in their own twisted purpose, it becomes a little more entrenched of a fight. And so we're going to finish this course by talking about biblical counterfeits. First, we'll deal with the Unitarian ones, then we'll deal with the polytheistic ones like Mormonism, and then we'll deal with the pseudo-messianic ones, which are like, people who follow guys like David Koresh or whatever. So all that to say, we're done for tonight, and we'll continue next time. And so are there